Well, let's bring in Professor Christopher Asike, President of the African Association of Political Science and Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. We're joining him via Zoom. Professor Asike, thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. What's your reading of the U.S.'s airstrikes on Venezuela? Let's start there.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. The U.S. airstrike on Venezuela last night presents a complex blend of security, legal, and geopolitical issues that presents multiple challenges, for the global order. So, if I'm to just break this down quickly, strategically, the U.S. Articulated a counter-drug and anti-criminal justification for the kind of kinetic action that they've taken against Venezuelan targets in the last couple of months. And this is now culminated in the capture of the president of the country, Nicolas Maduro, in what we would refer to as regime change. Now, legally, this kind of military operation sits outside of clear international law paradigms that govern the use of force, raising questions, constitutional questions within the U.S. context, and also at the international law level, presenting clear sovereignty disputes, if you like. Then at the regional level, this kind of military intervention risks destabilizing a fragile, the fragile political balances that we have in Latin America, because it erodes, trust among neighbors and provokes broader diplomatic backlash, even though one can argue that Nicolas Maduro was not a very popular president in Latin America, especially after the last election that is stolen in 2024. And then normatively speaking, and this is important for those of us that study international relations, this U.S. military action, like the one they did over 30 years ago against Noriega of Panama, it challenges established post-1995 restraint on unilateral military action or coercion, and poses implications for interstate relations and conflict resolution globally. So overall, in my view, this is a military invasion of a sovereign country by another, and it is illegal as it contravenes both international and U.S. domestic law. So on the U.S. side, for example, the U.S. Constitution makes it compulsory for a U.S. president to abide by international law instruments such as the UN Charter and then the Convention on Human and Political Rights. And also, the role of Congress in authorizing such a military invasion was bypassed. However, when one considers the responsibility to protect doctrine and the relief that this will bring for majority of Venezuelans, including its over 10 million in the diaspora, there can be a case that the U.S. and full sympathizers to these kinds of intervention can make. But the normative question remains, how do you resolve an illegality with another illegality?
All right, Professor Christopher Asike, I'd like you to expand on some of the statements you made. You called it an illegal military invasion. The attack on Venezuela comes weeks after airstrikes against Nigeria. What do the two incidents say about the U.S. foreign policy in general under Donald Trump?
In the strikes against Iran and other countries since Trump came to power under a year ago now. And all of them, including the two that you referenced, the Venezuelan and the Nigerian case, mark a departure from the post-World War II U.S. pattern of privileging coalition action, diplomatic engagement, and following international legal frameworks. Now, instead, what we are seeing a reflection of an assertive, personalized and power-projected foreign policy approach that would have lasting implications for, regional stability in Latin America, and then also international norms that govern sovereignty and the future role of U.S. military engagements in the Americas and beyond. And you will see the clear evidence of this kind of personalized power projection-oriented foreign policy by just listening to President Trump's address to Americans and the world a few minutes ago.
Professor, how worried should African countries with tense relations with the U.S. be at this time?
Again, it's not just African countries that should be worried, okay, but the entire world, including even those in the West who are supposed to be Western allies. Many of them are alarmed. We've heard President Emmanuel Macron of France condemn this. And you also heard what Marco Rubio said in the press conference just now about this, right? The whole world should be on the lookout. But to answer your question more directly, African states that have tense relations with the United States should be concerned at the level of strategic prudence, not necessarily as an imminent threat, for them. The military invasion of Venezuela and the abduction of its president does signal a lower tolerance for adversarial government and a broader box of coercive options that the U.S. can take against any country, including those that they don't agree with in Africa. But geography, operational constraints, and geo-regional politics will make it difficult for the United States to replicate this kind of action that it took in Venezuela in Africa. So it's unlikely, except maybe in high-risk jurisdictions where there's a blend of security, criminal, and geopolitical factors all converging to pose serious concern for the U.S.
Professor, would you say African leaders have been cautious to respond? And if so, why is that the case?
Well, South Africa has responded, so it's not that African leaders have been cautious. One would have expected South Africa to be muted, like say Nigeria, for example, has been. But South Africa has indicated support for United Nations Security Council meeting to discuss this, given the wider implications for multilateralism, peace building, and the sovereignty issues around this. But of course, like I said, African countries need to study this very carefully, and this is another need for us to articulate a common agenda for engaging with the United States.
Professor, before we let you go, finally, where do these attacks leave, one, multilateralism, international peace, and of course, security in the world?
Well, look, the Venezuelan strike represents not only a tactical military episode, but a structural shock to the global security order, like I said before. And its most significant effects lie in the erosion of multilateral legitimacy, the normalization of unilateral coercive practice, and then the heightened volatility of international peace and security environments. And if I can take 1 minute to just expatiate a little bit on this, these U.S. attacks poses negative implications for multilateralism in the sense that it weakens, the collective security architecture and reinforces unilateralism. It increases strategic mistrust and conflict risks in fragile regions and great power competition zones, and Africa is not exempt from this, as well. And that's why we need to be very cautious. And then it also incentivizes sovereignty securitization, which may deepen authoritarianism and domestic repression.
All right, let's leave it there. Professor Christopher Asike, President of the African Association of Political Science, speaking to us via Zoom from Pretoria. Thanks for that. Earlier, we spoke to Jiang Shi-Shui, Professor and Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University, on his take on the situation in Venezuela. Let's listen in.
But anyway, this kind of crisis has a nature of U.S. imperialism against a sovereign nation. And the purpose of the U.S. action is to do a kind of regime change. And also, economically speaking, I believe that the U.S. wants to return to the oil industry in Venezuela because of the so-called nationalization policy imposed by Chavez and Maduro. The U.S. oil companies have left the oil field in Venezuela. So I think this kind of action by the U.S. Is two-dimensional, politically and economically. So let's see what will happen. I believe that no one really is really capable of ruling the country, Venezuela. The opposition is not in a nice position to rule this country. So let's see what will happen in the next few days. the countries in the region are going to face an unpeaceful environment. This region has declared itself as a zone of peace. And now this zone of peace has been broken down by the US imperialist action. So this is a tragedy for the people in America. Since 1999, when Chavez came to power, the government of Venezuela has been carrying out a foreign policy of anti-US imperialist. So the US is very angry with this South American country, and the US has been imposing all kinds of sanctions against Venezuela. So the people in Venezuela suffer, and it's reported that quite a few million people have left this country, beautiful country. Well, now the US just wants to see a regime change, but who knows who can really run the country? Okay, so I hope that as a UN Security Council will do something. So I often ask myself, where is the United Nations? Where is the international law? So people everywhere are asking if the president of the United States will really get the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. I think the whole situation will not become, well, who really knows? I believe that the US even cannot know the answer to this kind of crisis. And, in the past several years, this beautiful South American country has been suffering from political crisis, economic crisis, and a social crisis. And now I believe that these multiple crises will get worse and worse, and people in Venezuela will suffer more in the near future.
Well, we have with us Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira, lecturer in international relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. He joins us live via Zoom from Sao Paulo. Welcome to The World Today. Thank you for joining us. What is your take on the U.S.'s airstrikes on Venezuela?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So, Venezuela is clearly subject to the violation of international law. Certainly, Mr. Maduro was a dictator, an authoritarian ruler. However, the way he was ousted points out to a new pattern of intervention of the United States in Latin America, which may open a kind of Pandora box for a new age of imperialism in the region by our most powerful neighbor from the north. However, it's important to think about not just what happened last night in the last hours, but also about what lies ahead for Venezuela. It's totally unclear. Trump says that the U.S. is going to manage Venezuela, which unfortunately sounds, to say the least, a kind of imperial rule. Let's see what awaits for the future for Venezuelan people. However, it's quite a return to patterns that were quite frequent in the 19th century and that we in Latin America thought that were already over.
All right, you mentioned new pattern of intervention. What is your assessment of the indictment now of a foreign leader by an American court?
It's understandable that the United States has major concerns about drug trafficking. That's indeed a major problem that affects not only American people, but also peoples in all Americas. Just think of countries other than Venezuela, like Mexico. Even here in Brazil, we really suffer with drug lords intervening over communities, particularly poor communities. Having said that, I do think that what Maduro is facing now, charged under U.S. law and being arrested by U.S. special forces, is not the right way to settle things. The United States would have benefited mostly should it have pursued partnerships with neighboring countries of Venezuela and facilitated a transition of power in which the scenes and this instability that has been generated by U.S. action in Venezuela without all this happening right now. So what the United States points out, therefore, is the emergence not just of a new interventionism, for some people a new kind of imperialism, but also what is a clear violation of sovereignty and extraterritoriality, which implies in ranking countries depending on their level of sovereignty. And clearly all Latin American countries now, and any potential leader or any leader, may be subject to this type of extraterritoriality approach brought by the Trump administration.
All right, let's leave it there for now. Mr. Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira, lecturer in international relations